My wife sneaked into our son's room every night, whispering words I couldn't hear. I thought she was hiding something from me, maybe someone. But when I installed a camera to catch her secret, the truth it revealed didn't betray me. It broke me, because it wasn't meant for either of us anymore. I used to think our house went quiet after midnight, but lately it wasn't quiet at all. It was breathing. A strange rhythm in the dark, soft footsteps down the hall, the faint creak of a door that was supposed to stay closed. For weeks I told myself it was nothing. The old wood floors, the wind shifting through the windows. But one night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, I heard it clearly, my wife's footsteps. Slow, careful, almost guilty. Then the sound of our son's door opening. I checked the clock, 12:17 a.m., the same time as the night before, and the night before that. Our son Ethan was 22, a quiet, thoughtful kid who'd been living with us again since dropping out of college to figure things out. His room used to be his childhood space, filled with model airplanes and old baseball posters. Now it was dim, cluttered, and smelled faintly of cigarettes. He swore he didn't smoke. My wife, Emma, had always been gentle with him. Too gentle, maybe. Ever since he came home, she treated him like the boy he used to be, not the man he was trying to become. She knocked softly before entering, folded his laundry herself, and waited up for him even when I told her to rest. But lately there was something different. The way she'd pause before dinner glancing toward the hallway. The way she'd lower her voice whenever Ethan came downstairs. And then those midnight visits. I remember lying there listening to the muffled murmur of her voice through the wall. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone warm, aching, almost pleading. Then silence. Then the faint sound of her crying. The first time I pretended to sleep. The second, I sat up waiting. By the fifth night, my chest burned with questions I couldn't ask. Why go to him in the dark? Why every night, and why the secrecy? From me of all people. I told myself I trusted her. We'd been married 30 years. We'd survived layoffs, debt, my father's death, even the loneliness that crept in when we both stopped talking about dreams. But trust has a sound, and that night it cracked under the weight of her whisper. The next morning, I watched her make coffee. She looked tired, but calm, like someone who'd spent the night confessing to ghosts. Her hand trembled as she poured mine, and I caught her avoiding my eyes. Rough night, I asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that ends before it begins. Couldn't sleep, she said. I nodded. You should see a doctor. She only whispered, I'm fine, and turned away. The moment lingered, small, fragile, but heavy enough to shift the air between us. By the end of the week, I had convinced myself that I needed proof. Not to accuse her, no. I told myself it was to protect her, to understand. That's the lie we tell ourselves when love starts to ache, that our suspicion is care. So I went online and bought a camera, a small, silent one. I told the seller it was for home safety. Maybe it was. Maybe I was just trying to keep our home from disappearing piece by piece while we were still in it. That evening, while Emma showered, I slipped into Ethan's room. The space felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy. His desk was cluttered with unopened mail, the lamp flickering slightly, as if resisting the light. I set the camera high on the bookshelf, angled toward the door, a single red dot blinking like a heartbeat. When I stepped out, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. A man hiding secrets from the woman he once trusted more than himself. That night I didn't sleep. I watched the hallway through the crack of our bedroom door. And right on time, at 12:17, the shadow appeared. Emma. She moved softly, almost floating, her nightgown brushing the floor. She opened Ethan's door, slipped inside, and closed it gently behind her. I waited 10 minutes, 15, 30. The door didn't open again. When she finally returned, her eyes were red. She climbed into bed beside me without a word. The scent of Ethan's room, old smoke and dust, followed her. I stared at the ceiling until dawn painted the edges of our curtains gold. The next evening, as she cooked dinner, she asked if I'd like to join them for a movie later, just the three of us. Her tone was normal light, but her hands were shaking as she sliced the tomatoes. Sure, I said. What are we watching? She smiled faintly. Something old. Something you liked when we first met. That night, we sat together in the living room. Ethan hardly spoke. Emma leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, as if nothing was wrong. Yet every time the screen flickered, I saw her reflection, those same red-rimmed eyes that weren't from onions or sleep, but from something she'd buried deep. When the credits rolled, she kissed my cheek and whispered goodnight. She didn't go to bed, at least not ours. I heard the hallway creak again at 12:17. And that was when I decided tomorrow I'd watch the recording. Because sometimes the hardest part of love is not losing trust. It's realizing you might have to find the truth alone. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that hides more than it reveals. Emma was already gone. Her cup rinsed her scent, faint in the kitchen air. Ethan's door was shut. I poured coffee black and stared at the mug until the steam went thin. I told myself I wouldn't look at the footage right away. But truth is, a noise you can't turn off once it starts calling your name. By noon, I was in my study, curtains half drawn, laptop humming. The memory card slid in with a small click that sounded louder than it should have. For a moment, I just sat there watching the little triangle of the play icon blink. My finger hovered. Then I pressed it. The room filled with silence, only the faint hiss of background noise from the recording. At first, nothing. The empty hallway. Then 12:17 a.m. The bedroom door opened. Emma. Her silhouette looked softer. In the camera's grain, her face, half shadow, half glow, from the nightlight by Ethan's desk. She stood at the threshold for several seconds, not moving. Then she whispered something I couldn't make out. Her hand trembled as she reached for the air, as if touching something invisible. And then she said his name. Not Ethan's. Her voice cracked, like she was calling out to a ghost. John, please, help him see you again. My chest tightened. She stepped closer to Ethan's bed, brushed the hair from his forehead, then sat beside him, speaking low, so low the microphone barely caught it. You still blame him, don't you? She whispered. But he blames himself more. He doesn't know how to come back. My reflection trembled on the laptop screen. I leaned forward, volume up. She reached into her robe and took out something small, metallic, then set it on Ethan's nightstand. A watch. My old watch, the one I had stopped wearing after the accident last winter. I hadn't even realized she'd kept it. Ethan stirred half awake. Mom, shh, she said gently. It's okay. I'm here. I dreamt about Dad again, he murmured. He was angry. Emma stroked his hair. He's not angry, sweetheart. He's lost, just like you. I can't talk to him, Ethan mumbled. Then talk to me, she said. He'll hear you through me. He turned away, face buried in the pillow. I don't want to, he whispered. He stopped listening years ago. Something inside me cracked, soft, quiet, but final. Emma stayed there for almost an hour, sometimes silent, sometimes murmuring words that blurred with the hum of the camera. When she finally left, she paused. At the door, looked back toward the lens. No, not at the lens. Straight at the space where she thought I might have been standing unseen. Please come back to us, she said. The video ended. I sat there unmoving, hearing the echo of my own breath. The truth wasn't what I'd expected. There was no affair, no secret lover, no betrayal of the body. Only the slow erosion of something deeper, the silence between father and son, husband and wife. I closed the laptop, but the image stayed my wife kneeling beside our grown son, begging him to forgive the man sleeping down the hall. I tried to remember when Ethan and I had last spoken without anger. Maybe 2 years ago, before he left school. I'd called him weak, told him the world doesn't wait for quitters. He'd stared at me with those same gray eyes and said, then maybe I'll stop waiting for you too. After that, words turned into walls. Now I saw what those walls had done to him, to her, to all of us. That night I couldn't eat. I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, tracing circles in the condensation of my glass. At 12:15, I heard the floor creak again. I didn't move. 12:17. Door opens. Soft steps. This time I stood. Each step down the hallway felt like walking into my own grave. When I reached Ethan's door, I stopped. The light under it was faint golden. I heard her voice again, gentle pleading, repeating my name. My hand trembled on the doorknob. I almost turned it. Almost. But something held me back. The same cowardice that keeps men like me alive and half dead at once. The fear of being seen, not as the husband or the father, but as the wound itself. I pressed my forehead to the door, listening. Inside, Ethan's voice broke through, Mom. Stop waiting for him. He doesn't care. And Emma's answer came soft, but certain. You're wrong. He does. He just doesn't know how to show it anymore. Silence. Then the sound of her crying. I stepped away, heart pounding. Went back to bed. Stared into the dark ceiling that had heard too many unsaid things. When dawn came, I opened the laptop again. The cursor blinked over the frozen image of her face. I replayed it once, twice, 3 times, until I could memorize every tremor, every tear. Then I deleted the file, not to hide it, to stop watching what I had already done to them. The next morning over breakfast, I said quietly, Emma, maybe we should have dinner together tomorrow, just the 3 of us. She looked surprised, then nodded. He might not say much. I know, I said. I just want to listen. She smiled, a tired, small smile, but for the first time in months, it reached her eyes. Later that day, I went into the garage and found the broken watch strap that used to belong to that same timepiece. I fixed it, cleaned the face, wound it back up. The ticking filled the silence, like forgiveness measured in seconds. I left it on Ethan's desk before leaving for work. That night, I didn't stay up to spy. I sat outside on the porch, watching the window glow faintly at 12:17. 2 shadows moved inside hers and his. No whispers reached me, just the rhythm of a heartbeat. Returning home. But peace isn't earned in one night. It waits. It tests. It asks you to walk back through every silence you created. And tomorrow when the clock strikes 12:17, again, I'll be there. Not behind a door, not behind a camera, but beside them. The morning after, the house felt unusually still, like it was holding its breath. No echoes of late footsteps. No whispering through walls. Just the soft hum of sunlight sneaking through the blinds. Emma was in the kitchen, her back to me, stirring oatmeal in quiet circles. The scent of cinnamon filled the air, a smell I hadn't noticed in months. It was the one she used to make for Ethan when he was a boy, when he'd wake up late for school, and she'd coax him to eat something warm before running out the door. Morning, I said. She turned startled, as if caught doing something she shouldn't. Oh, morning? Her voice was thin, polite. The kind people use when they've forgotten what warmth sounds like. I sat down, and for a while we didn't speak. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same rhythm as the watch I'd left on Ethan's desk. Finally, she said, he found it, the watch. She nodded. He didn't say much, just held it for a long time. Then he said, it still smells like your cologne. I swallowed. He didn't throw it away. Her eyes softened. No. He put it in his drawer. Like he used to when he was little, hiding things he was scared to lose. We both smiled, but it wasn't happiness. It was the kind of smile that remembers pain and forgives it for existing. Then she set down her spoon and said, you watched the footage, didn't you? The question came so quietly that it didn't even sound like accusation. Just truth spoken aloud. Because it needed air. I didn't deny it. Yes. Her shoulders sank, but she didn't look angry. I thought so. The camera was too new. And you've been quieter. I nodded. I had to know. Know what, John? That you weren't hiding someone. She turned fully toward me, and for the first time in weeks, her gaze met mine, not as wife to husband, but as soul to soul. You really thought that's what it was. I hesitated. I didn't know what else to think. You kept going into his room, whispering, crying. You stopped talking to me. She sighed and looked at the floor. You never asked me why. That silence between us, it hurt more than any accusation. She wasn't wrong. I hadn't asked. I'd assumed. Because that's what men like me do when we lose control. We trade curiosity for suspicion. Her voice trembled as she said, He talks in his sleep, you know, every night since the accident. I frowned. What accident? The night you almost died. The words hit like cold water. It was snowing that night. I'd swerved off the road, coming home from work, hit a guardrail. I'd survived with a concussion and a fractured rib, nothing life-threatening. But it was the look on Ethan's face when he saw me in that hospital bed that stuck. He'd said, You scared us, Dad, but his eyes were saying something else. Something he never said again after that night. Emma continued softly. He blames himself. He thinks you were driving home, angry, after the fight you two had that morning. I remembered it now, the argument about his college tuition. I'd said words no father should ever say. If you're going to waste your life, at least stop wasting my money. I'd slammed the door, driven off, without looking back. My chest tightened. He thinks that's why. Yes. Her eyes glistened. He wakes up around midnight every night, mumbling, I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean it. Sometimes he cries. Sometimes he just stares at the wall. And you sleep through it. I sat back numb. I go to his room, she said, because you won't. Because if he can't say it to you, someone has to listen. Her hand trembled around the coffee cup. He talks about you like you're gone. Like you died that night and only your body came back. Her words carved a hollow inside me. I didn't know how to answer. So I didn't. She turned away again, wiping her eyes. I thought if he could forgive himself, maybe he'd stop breaking. Maybe you'd notice him again. But then I realized her voice faltered. I was the one hiding from the truth. I looked up. What truth? She met my eyes and the sunlight caught the wet edge of her lashes. That I lost both of you. One to silence, the other to shame. The kitchen went quiet. Outside a bird chirped, once, faint, distant, like a memory of spring that didn't belong to us anymore. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I didn't. I didn't deserve to. Instead, I asked, What do I do now? She gave a sad little smile. You start by not hiding behind cameras. The truth of that line stung more than anything. That night, I stood outside Ethan's room again, not with suspicion, but with something heavier, remorse. I could hear faint music from his speaker, the kind he used to play when doing homework as a kid. The smell of smoke still lingered. I knocked. Once. Twice. Yeah. His voice was tired, guarded. It's me. A pause, then come in. When I stepped inside, he didn't look up. He sat at his desk, sketching something mechanical lines like the old airplanes he used to love. I took a breath. I saw the watch. He froze. Mom told you I fixed the strap, I said. Didn't think it'd still tick. He nodded slowly. Yeah, it does. Silence filled the space between us. The kind that used to mean distance, but now felt like possibility. Finally, I said I'm sorry for everything I made you carry. He looked up, then truly looked. You're not the one who almost, I interrupted. I was angry, reckless, stupid. I drove like the world owed me something. It wasn't your fault. He blinked fast, eyes wet. Mom said you wouldn't say that. She knows me better than I do. He laughed a short, cracked laugh that still had childhood inside it. Then he nodded. Okay. I stepped closer. Can I sit? He shrugged, but I saw his jaw unclench. We sat there side by side, the clock ticking quietly on his nightstand. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, as if time had circled back, he said, You ever wish we could just start over? I looked at him, the young man, the boy, the reflection of every mistake I'd ever made, and said softly, Every day. He nodded again. Maybe we still can. When I left the room, Emma was standing in the hallway, eyes glistening. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was breathing again. And for the first time in months, when the clock struck 12:17, the house stayed quiet. Not because there were no whispers left, but because at last there was nothing left to hide. The next morning I woke before the sun. The air was cold enough that every breath felt like a reminder that I was still here, still allowed another chance. Down the hallway, I could hear Emma moving quietly, making breakfast. No whispers behind doors this time. No secrets tucked between footsteps. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. Maybe they had always looked this way, and I just hadn't stopped long enough to see them. When I walked into the kitchen, Ethan was already there pouring cereal into a bowl, like a man pretending not to be a boy again. Emma smiled faintly as she poured coffee for both of us. The silence wasn't tense. It was fragile, like the first bridge you build after a long storm. We ate together, unremarkably, but it felt like something sacred. At one point, Emma said he's going to look at apartments this week. Ethan frowned, just thinking about it. I might not move yet. I glanced at him. Take your time. He nodded. Thanks, Dad. The way he said it, Dad simple, without bitterness, without walls, it almost undid me. After breakfast, Emma went to tend the garden. Ethan stayed behind, scrolling through his phone. I was about to leave the table when he said, Hey, you remember that old voicemail thing you used to set up for the shop? I blinked. The plumbing business one? Yeah, you left one on your phone once. I was trying to find a file, and I heard it. You were giving instructions to one of your guys. He smiled a little. You sounded calmer back then. That sentence hit me deeper than he meant it to. When he went out for a walk later, I found the phone in the drawer of my study. Same one I'd used for work before I shut everything down after the accident. I scrolled through the recordings, old invoices, call logs, the usual noise of a life I thought I'd left behind. Then I found it, voicemail, February 18, 2022. I pressed play. My own voice filled the room, younger, steadier. Hey, it's John. If you're calling about the leak in the Ridgeway property, I'll swing by after lunch. If it's urgent, you know where to find me. Don't lose hope. Everything's fixable. You just have to find the leak. Then a click. That was it, 10 seconds. But the last line stayed echoing in my head. Everything's fixable. You just have to find the leak. Somehow, that felt bigger than pipes. I sat there for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand. There was a time when I used to believe that not just about my work, but about people, about family. I used to fix things because I couldn't stand seeing them break. Somewhere along the way, I stopped trying. Maybe I started treating people like pipes, waiting for them to burst before I cared enough to notice where they'd cracked. That afternoon, Emma went to visit her sister. The house was quiet again, but not haunted like before, just resting. I went into Ethan's room. The curtains were half open, letting in that muted gold light that always made everything feel softer. On his desk sat the watch ticking faintly. The sound filled the room with rhythm, steady, alive. Next to it lay his sketchbook. I flipped through the pages. He'd been drawing machines, complex, broken structures, being repaired piece by piece. Under one drawing, he'd written, "For Dad, everything's fixable." I didn't know if he meant it for me to find, but I did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the porch with a cup of black coffee, same as I used to every morning before work. The sky was clear, the kind of clarity that makes you think about how many nights you've wasted staring at ceilings instead of stars. At 12:17, out of habit, I looked toward Ethan's window, light off, the house finally still. That was when I heard something. Not footsteps, not whispers, just a sound from deep inside memory, replaying itself. My wife's voice, Ethan's voice. The sound of a door opening, not in the house, but in me. I closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I listened not to catch someone's secret, but to hear what silence had been trying to tell me. The truth was simple. Emma had never hidden anything from me. Ethan had never stopped waiting. It was me who'd built the walls, me who'd mistaken their reaching hands for shadows. And in that realization, in that quiet, came the stoic detonation point. It wasn't a burst of emotion or a loud confession. It was something deeper. The stillness of knowing I'd spent years fixing what was visible while ignoring what was broken inside. I thought of every father who's ever worked too late, every husband who thought silence meant strength. And I whispered, "I hear you," not to anyone else, but to the parts of me that had been deaf for too long. When Emma came back that evening, she found me asleep on the porch. She smiled faintly, put a blanket over my shoulders, and whispered, "Welcome home." I didn't wake, but I heard her. Because sometimes the things we choose to hear are the things that finally let us stay. It was strange how the house could feel different without anything really changing. Same walls, same furniture, same clock ticking against the quiet. And yet something in the air had shifted, like the whole place had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. 3 nights passed since Emma's confession. The midnight hour still came, but now it didn't bring ghosts. It brought waiting, listening, a kind of peace that still carried a pulse of ache underneath. I spent those days mostly in silence, fixing the loose hinge on the back door, tightening the bolts on the railing. The little things I'd ignored for months. Every creak, every screw felt like a confession in itself. I'd once built homes for strangers, but forgotten how to keep one alive for the people I loved. That evening, I found myself outside Ethan's room again, same hallway, same door. The wood still had the faint mark where he used to tape his childhood drawings, crooked airplanes, stick figure families, all smiling. I stood there, tracing the faint outline of the tape, remembering the nights I used to read him stories before bed. Back then, he'd fall asleep mid-sentence, his head on my shoulder mumbling about becoming a pilot. When did I stop knocking on this door? It was 11:58 p.m., too early for ghosts, too late for pride. I raised my hand and knocked. Once, twice. Yeah. His voice came groggy but calm. It's me, I said quietly. Can I come in? The pause was long enough to feel like years. Then, sure. I opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, laptop still open. Faint light casting half his face in gold, half in shadow, the same way I'd seen myself so many times in the mirror. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Not really, I said, managing a small smile. Old men and their thoughts. He chuckled lightly. Yeah, happens to me too. I walked in, stopping by the bookshelf. It still had the models we'd built together, dusty wings, chipped, but standing. One of them, the silver one, had a missing tailpiece. He noticed me staring at it. You never fixed that one, he said. I nodded. Didn't think you'd want me to. He shrugged. You could have asked. The simplicity of that answer hit deeper than it should have. I sat down across from him, the air between us quiet but steady. For a long while, we said nothing. Just two men, learning how to exist again without armor. Finally, I said, Your mom told me what you said about that night, the accident. He looked away. Yeah, you thought I crashed because of you. His jaw tightened. Didn't think I knew. You left angry. We fought. He stopped himself, eyes glistening. You didn't come back for hours. I thought you hated me. I took a breath that felt heavier than air. I didn't hate you, son. I hated myself for the way I made you feel small. For thinking being a father meant being right. He stared at the floor. The silence stretched, thick and trembling. Then softly I added, You didn't cause that accident. My own anger did. My pride did. He didn't look up, but his hands clenched into fists, slowly loosened. I reached into my pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper worn from my palm. I found this yesterday. You drew it when you were 6. He frowned, curious. I unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing, messy, uneven lines, but unmistakable. A man fixing a leaking pipe, water splashing everywhere. Above it, in crooked handwriting, he'd written, "Dad can fix anything." Ethan stared at it, lips parting slightly. "You kept that always?" I said. It reminded me who I was supposed to be. Somewhere along the way, I forgot. His eyes watered, and for the first time in years, he did and hide it. I used to believe that he whispered. "So did I said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of years of pain, of the strange relief that comes when both people finally stop pretending they're not broken. He took the drawing, holding it gently, and said, "You know, I used to come into your shop just to hear the sound of the tools. You'd be covered in dust, cursing at pipes, and I thought that's what strength looks like. Now I think maybe it's just showing up." I smiled faintly. Showing up's the hardest part. He nodded, eyes still red. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I missed you, Dad." That single sentence, those 3 words, undid something inside me I didn't know I'd still been holding together. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. It trembled not from age, but from release. "I missed you too," I said, "and I'm sorry it took me this long to come back." He didn't answer, just leaned forward slowly, hesitantly, until his forehead rested against my shoulder. I froze for a second, then wrapped my arms around him. The clock on his nightstand ticked quietly. 12:17 a.m. For the first time, that sound didn't haunt me. It steadied me. When we finally pulled apart, he wiped his eyes and said, "Guess you found the leak." "Huh?" I laughed, a real one this time. "Yeah. Took me long enough." He smiled. "Mom's gonna cry when she sees this." "She probably already knows," I said. We sat there for a while longer. No more words needed. The house around us breathed alive again. Before I left, I turned back at the door. "You know, I used to think fixing things meant putting them back the way they were." He looked up, and now I think it means learning to live with the cracks and making sure the light can still get through. He nodded, smiling faintly. "Good night, Dad. Good night, son." As I closed the door, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a quiet, ongoing choice, one you make every time you knock, instead of walk away. I walked back to my room, where Emma was reading in bed. She looked up and saw my face, and she didn't have to ask. She just reached out her hand. I took it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an intruder in my own home. The night that used to belong to whispers now belonged to peace. The morning light felt different. Not brighter, softer. It touched the curtains like it was afraid to wake anyone, then slipped quietly across the floorboards, landing on the old rug that used to belong to Emma's grandmother. It was the kind of light that didn't demand attention. It simply arrived and waited to be seen. I woke before the alarm. There was no restlessness this time, no weight in my chest, no ghosts pacing behind my ribs, just stillness, pure, uncomplicated stillness. Emma was still asleep beside me. Her hair had fallen across her face, one hand resting near my arm, her fingers barely touching my sleeve. A silent reminder that connection doesn't always come from words. I watched her for a moment, realizing how long it had been since I'd truly looked at her, without trying to read guilt or distance. All I saw now was someone who had carried far too much love for far too long, quietly, faithfully, even when I wasn't looking. When she opened her eyes, she smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just the kind of smile that says we made it through the night. "Coffee," she whispered. "Yeah," I said, voice rough with morning. "Let me make it today." She chuckled softly. "You sure you remember how I smiled?" "I'll improvise." In the kitchen, sunlight filled the air with a quiet gold. The same gold that used to color our mornings when Ethan was a boy, back when the three of us sat at this table without the weight of years pressing between us. I brewed the coffee, burnt the first batch, laughed to myself, then tried again. The smell of the second pot filled the room, and for a moment it felt like forgiveness had a scent. Ethan came downstairs not long after Hare, messy eyes still half asleep. But when he saw me at the counter, his mouth curled into something small and genuine. The kind of smile that doesn't need to hide behind sarcasm anymore. "Morning," I said. "Morning," he replied, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep. Guess I'm still learning how to rest." He grinned faintly. "You'll get there." Emma joined us a few minutes later, still in her robe, her hair tied up loosely. She looked at both of us, smiled, and said, "You two look like you finally stopped fighting gravity." We laughed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't careful. It was easy. As we ate together, eggs, toast, and coffee, that was too strong but somehow perfect, I found myself studying the small, ordinary movements that used to feel invisible. Emma wiping a crumb off Ethan's plate. Ethan thanking her without rolling his eyes. My own hand resting near hers, steady quiet. For years I'd been chasing some grand notion of peace. Something cinematic. Something that would arrive in a single moment of clarity. But sitting there that morning, I realized peace rarely makes an entrance. It just grows quietly in the spaces where anger used to live. After breakfast, Ethan stood by the window looking out into the yard. "You know, he said I might rebuild the old workbench out back, the one that's falling apart." I raised an eyebrow. "That thing's been dead for years." He smiled. "So were we, kinda." I laughed. "Point taken." He turned to me, hesitating. "You think you'd want to help?" Wouldn't miss it. That simple exchange, 6 words. No drama, felt like a lifetime being handed back in pieces. When he left to grab tools from the shed, Emma came up behind me and slipped her arms around my waist. Her voice was soft, barely above a breath. "You came back, John." I turned to face her. Maybe I never really left. I just forgot how to be here. She nodded, eyes wet, but steady. That's enough. We stood there in the kitchen sunlight, warming the tiles beneath our feet. For the first time in what felt like forever, silence wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. Later that day, Ethan and I worked side by side in the yard. The sun hung low, warm, forgiving. We replaced the cracked boards, sanded the rough edges, and painted the frame a muted gray. The smell of wood and dust filled the air. Every now and then, he'd glance at me, and I'd catch that quiet pride in his eyes, the same one I used to see when he was 10, holding a wrench twice the size of his hand, helping me fix a sink. "Hand me that nail," I said. He passed it over without a word. And in that exchange, that simple, wordless rhythm, something whole returned. When we finished, he leaned back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Looks solid," he said. "Not perfect," I replied. "But solid." He smiled. "Good enough for us." We stood there staring at what we'd built. It wasn't just a bench anymore. It was proof that some things once broken can still hold the weight of new beginnings. As dusk settled in, Emma called us for dinner. Her voice floated through the yard like music that had been waiting years to be played again. We sat together that night not as strangers, bound by routine, but as a family that had walked through silence and found its way back to sound. Later, as I lay in bed, I looked at the ceiling and thought about all the noise that used to fill this house. Arguments, slammed doors, unspoken words. Now, there was only quiet. But it wasn't empty. It was alive. And somewhere between that stillness and the steady tick of the clock, I realized the truth that Stoicism had been whispering to me all along. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It redeems it. It turns the ache into a teacher, the silence into a guide, and the wound into a window. The next morning, I would wake again to sunlight and coffee and the sound of Ethan's hammer in the yard. But that night, I fell asleep, knowing the world hadn't changed, only the way I listened to it. Because sometimes peace doesn't arrive with a doorbell. It just sits quietly at the table, waiting for you to notice. It was there all along. For years, the house had been nothing more than a collection of walls, a place we lived inside, not a place that lived with us. But something had shifted. It wasn't the furniture, or the paint, or the sunlight that filtered through the curtains differently now. It was the way the air moved, the way it carried laughter again. It started small. A half-forgotten song Emma hummed while washing dishes. Ethan whistling as he fixed the latch on the backyard gate. The smell of bread baking in the oven drifting through the hallways that used to echo with arguments. Every sound was a heartbeat. Every breath a second chance. I found myself walking slower through the house, noticing details I hadn't seen in years. The faint pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where Ethan's height was measured every birthday. The chipped corner of the dining table where I'd once dropped a wrench. The little scratch on the floor by the piano leg, where Emma's heels had caught the wood the night she tried to dance again after her back surgery. Every mark was proof we'd lived imperfectly, beautifully, honestly. One afternoon I came home from the shop, not to noise, but to something better movement. Ethan was in the yard sanding the bench we'd repaired. Emma sat nearby on the porch steps, trimming the dead leaves from her lilies. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their silence wasn't absence anymore. It was ease. "Looks good," I said, nodding toward the bench. Ethan smiled without looking up. "Still needs another coat." "Everything does," I replied. He laughed, that quiet, half-smile laugh that always reminded me of his mother. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, Emma said, "Do you remember when this table used to feel too big?" I nodded. "Yeah, 3 chairs, and still too far apart." She smiled. "Not anymore." She reached out, placing her hand over mine. Ethan looked up from his plate, caught the gesture, and smiled too. That was the moment I realized this was what healing really looked like. Not grand apologies or perfect endings, but the quiet courage to stay in the same room again. After dinner, Emma went upstairs to read. Ethan lingered behind, rinsing dishes without being asked. He looked different lately, not because he'd changed much physically, but because the weight behind his eyes had lifted. "You know," he said, drying his hands, "I used to hate this house." I looked at him. Why? Because every sound reminded me of what we weren't saying. Every creak, every clock tick felt like guilt. But now, I kind of like it. I nodded slowly. "Houses don't change, son. People do. The house just follows." He grinned faintly. "Then I guess it's finally catching up to us." That night I walked the hallway again, the same path I'd once taken, in anger, suspicion, fear. I stopped at his door, not to listen, not to spy, but to simply hear the quiet. Inside, his breathing was steady, peaceful. It struck me then we spend half our lives chasing meaning, thinking it hides in the loud moments, in victories, confrontations, dramatic resolutions. But sometimes meaning hides in the silence that comes after, the kind that hums beneath the floorboards, alive and forgiving. The next morning, I woke to the smell of pancakes. Emma was laughing in the kitchen, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who's decided to live again. Ethan flipped a pancake in the pan, almost dropped it, and she clapped like he'd just won a medal. "Don't encourage him," I said, stepping in. She smiled. "He's doing better than you ever did." "Untrue," I said, grinning. "Mine didn't burn." Ethan laughed. "Yours just never made it out of the pan." We all laughed. It felt like the sound had been waiting years to escape these walls. When breakfast ended, Ethan grabbed his keys and said, "I'm heading to that interview today." I blinked. "Interview?" "Yeah, construction firm downtown. Mom told me to try. Said fixing things runs in the blood." Emma winked at me. "He got that from you?" I smiled. "No, he got the courage from you." He paused at the door, looked back and said, "I'll call when I'm done." "Don't rush it," I said. "Just show up." He nodded. "I will." After he left, I stood by the window, watching him drive away. There was no ache this time, only gratitude. Watching your child move forward doesn't always mean losing them. Sometimes it means you finally did something right. Emma joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "You're quiet," she said. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how long it takes for a house to start breathing again." She smiled softly. Maybe it never stopped. Maybe we just forgot how to listen. Her words sank into me like warmth into wood. That evening, when Ethan came home, his eyes were bright. "They hired me," he said, almost disbelieving. Emma gasped, hugged him. I stood there frozen for a moment, then walked up and pulled him into an embrace that said everything words couldn't. "Proud of you?" I whispered. He smiled against my shoulder. "Thanks, Dad." Later that night, I sat on the porch looking at the house from outside. The windows glowed softly. Inside, I could hear the faint hum of Emma humming, the quiet rhythm of footsteps, the soft click of dishes being put away. And in that moment, I realized something simple and true. Forgiveness doesn't bring you back to where you were. It brings you to where you were always meant to go. The wind picked up gentle and cold, and the chimes by the porch began to sing. For the first time, I didn't hear the house as a burden. I heard it breathe. It inhaled through the walls, through the laughter, through the silence we'd finally learned to live with. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered to the air, "Thank you for waiting." The week passed quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty anymore. I'd begun to notice how mornings now carried a rhythm, the sound of the kettle, whistling, Emma's soft humming in the kitchen, Ethan's boots on the steps as he left for work. The house wasn't silent. It was alive again, breathing. But peace has a strange way of returning with reminders. It doesn't erase the past. It hands it back to you gently and asks if you're ready to hold it without trembling. It was Saturday morning when I found the old tape recorder. Buried deep in the drawer of my desk, under years of forgotten bills and worn-out keys, it sat there, small dust-covered and waiting. I didn't even remember keeping it. I'd used it years ago, back when things were simpler, before everything broke, before silence became our language. The label on the cassette read March 17th, Ethan's birthday, 2008. I stared at it for a long while. Then slowly I pressed play. The tape crackled, that faint nostalgic hiss of time. Then came my voice. "Hey, buddy, you're 10 today. I just finished fixing the leak in Mrs. Carpenter's bathroom, and I couldn't stop thinking about how you said last week that you wanted to be a builder. Maybe you got that from me. Maybe you didn't. But either way, keep building. Build things that last. Build people up, too." Then there was laughter, Emma's. "He's smiling, John. You can't see it, but he's smiling. You think he'll ever listen to this? When he's older," I'd said. "If we're lucky," she whispered. The sound faded, then returned, my voice again softer. "Son, when you're older. And if you ever doubt yourself, remember everything you build will break someday. Even the good things. But don't let that scare you. That's how you know they mattered." The tape clicked, then silence. I sat there frozen. My hands shook as I lifted the cassette from the player. For a long time, I couldn't move. The voice on that tape wasn't the man I'd become. It was the man I had buried under pride, fear, and anger. The man my family had been whispered to in the dark for years. And suddenly I understood. Emma hadn't been whispering to Ethan. She'd been whispering for him, carrying the sound of that man, the one who'd once believed in love, without conditions, into a house that had forgotten his voice. I felt something shift inside, not regret exactly, but recognition. The realization that time doesn't just take things away. It also waits patient and quiet for you to find the pieces you left behind. That night I sat in the living room with Emma. The lamp beside us glowed a faint gold, throwing soft light across her face. She was reading glasses, low on her nose. "Emma," I said quietly, "I found something." She looked up. "What is it?" I placed the tape recorder on the table. From Ethan's 10th birthday, her breath caught. "I thought we lost that." "So did I." I pressed play. The room filled with our younger selves, laughing, talking, promising things we'd later forget. Emma's eyes glistened. She reached for my hand, holding it tightly. When the tape ended, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent, the kind that comes when time folds in on itself, letting you stand face to face with who you used to be. Emma wiped a tear. "You were a good father, John." I shook my head. "I was trying to be." "You still are," she said gently. "You just learned the hard way that love isn't a thing you fix. It's a thing you return to." Her words landed deep, as they always did. Later that night, I found Ethan in his room, hunched over a sketch pad. "Got a minute?" I asked. "Sure," he said, sitting up. I placed the recorder on his desk. "Listen to this." He raised an eyebrow, but hit play. When he heard my younger voice, his eyes widened. Then slowly, something in his expression softened. A child recognizing a sound he'd almost forgotten. When it ended, he sat back. "That was you." "Yeah." He smiled faintly. "You sounded lighter." I said. "And I'm trying to find that man again." He nodded. "I think you already did." There was silence between us, not of distance, but understanding. Then he said quietly, "Can I keep it?" "Of course," I replied. "It's yours." He picked it up, thumb brushing the worn label. "You know, he said Mom used to come in here and talk to me like that every night, after you got hurt. She'd tell me about the way you used to be, the way you laughed, the way you'd make anything seem fixable. I think she was trying to remind me that you were still in there somewhere." I swallowed hard. She was right. He smiled. "Yeah, she usually is." When I left his room, I paused at the door, the same doorway that had once divided us. Now, it felt like a passage back to something we'd lost and finally reclaimed. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the recorder still faintly humming from where it had been rewound. I stared at the tape, thinking about how strange it was, how the past can still speak, how voices can travel through decades and find you when you need them most. I pressed record. "Ethan," I began, my voice steady But lo, if you ever listen to this maybe years from now, I just want you to know something. You didn't save me. You reminded me that I was worth saving. And your mother, she never stopped believing that the man on that first tape would come home again. I paused, letting the quiet breathe. Don't wait for perfect moments. Just show up. That's how you build a life. That's how you fix what matters. I clicked stop. The red light faded. The tape stilled. But the truth, the one buried beneath years of silence, kept playing inside me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of remembering without fear. When I turned off the light, the house exhaled softly, alive, breathing, listening. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after you tell the truth. Not the silence of absence, but of release. It's like the house itself exhales the air, rearranging into something lighter, freer. That's what the next morning felt like. Ethan had left early for work. Emma was in the garden, her hands deep in soil, planting something new in the space where weeds used to grow. I watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, wondering how many years she'd been doing this, tending to life, even when I'd forgotten to. The old recorder sat beside me on the table. The sunlight glinted off its metal edge. I hadn't told Emma yet about the second tape, the one I'd made the night before. It wasn't meant for anyone right now. Maybe not even for them. Maybe for a future that would outlive me. But something about that morning felt final. Not in a tragic way, in a complete way. Like a circle quietly closing. I pressed play again on the first tape, the one from 2008. The crackle, my younger laughter, Ethan's giggle in the background. The sound of Emma's voice calling from another room. And then that one line, everything you build will break someday, even the good things. But that's how you know they mattered. I'd meant those words as advice to a boy. I didn't know they'd come back years later as a sermon to a man who had forgotten them. The Stoics always said, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. For years I'd lived inside imagined betrayals, self-made ghosts. I'd punished myself for versions of the truth that never existed. And all the while, life had been waiting right here, patient, steady, and kind. Emma came up the steps, brushing dirt from her hands. You're listening to it again? Yeah, I said, trying to hear the man I used to be. She smiled faintly. He's not gone, John. He just got quiet. I nodded, and something in my chest softened, the last hard piece of guilt dissolving into something human again. She sat beside me, the morning light catching the fine lines around her eyes. You know what's funny? She said. When you crashed that night, the doctor told me you'd been unconscious for 3 minutes. But for me, it felt like 3 years. I turned to her. You thought I wasn't coming back. She looked down. I didn't think I could lose both of you. So I made sure at least one of you kept breathing. Her words hit with a quiet force. That was a detonation point, not loud, not fiery, but clean and absolute. The moment the story stopped being about suspicion or loss and became about what love really does, it waits. It endures. It carries what the other can't. I reached over, took her hand. I heard the tape, I said. And for the first time, I believed what I said back then. She tilted her head. What part? That everything we build will break, but it's still worth building. She smiled through tears. Then maybe it's time to build again. That afternoon, I drove out to the coast, the same stretch of road where the accident had happened years ago. The air smelled like salt and pine, the wind cutting just cold enough to keep you awake. I parked by the guardrail, the metal still scarred where my car had hit it. For a long while, I just stood there listening. The sea was calm today, the waves small and rhythmic. I took the tape recorder out of my pocket, pressed record, and spoke into it, not to leave another message, but to leave a truth behind. "This is John Miller," I said quietly. "I used to think fixing things meant making them look the way they did before they broke. Now I know it means learning to live with the cracks and trusting that the light will find its way through. If you ever find this, whoever you are, don't wait for peace to arrive. It's not coming. You have to make it one small act of forgiveness at a time. And if you ever love someone, tell them before they start whispering to the dark." I stopped the tape. The wind carried the sound of waves against the rocks, soft, eternal. Then, without thinking, I placed the recorder on the guardrail, the same place where I'd once lost everything, and I walked away. Not as a man who was leaving something behind, but as one finally free to go forward. When I got home, Ethan was in the yard hammering a final nail into the bench we'd built together. He looked up, sweat on his forehead, and smiled. "Perfect timing," he said. "Looks solid," I answered. He nodded. "Yeah, but not too perfect. You taught me that cracks make it real." I laughed softly. Guess I did. Emma came out with lemonade, and for a moment I stood there watching the two of them framed in the fading gold of dusk, the house behind them breathing like a living thing. This was it. The quiet detonation. The moment that didn't destroy, but remade. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." I used to think that meant control. Now I know it means surrender to truth, to love, to imperfection. As the light faded, I sat on the porch beside them. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't waiting for words anymore. It was full of everything that had been lost, found, and finally accepted. When the clock struck 12:17, the air was still. No whispers, no footsteps, no secrets. Just three people breathing together. The chair by the window had always been mine. Not officially, no one called it that, but everyone knew. It was where I drank my morning coffee, where I read the paper I never finished, where I sat most evenings, just thinking. Funny thing is, I'd spent years in that same chair without ever really being there. Today was different. The house was quiet, in the way only peace can make it. Not an empty quiet, but a breathing one. Emma was in the kitchen, humming. Ethan's laughter carried faintly from outside the sound of a hammer tapping rhythmically on the wood he'd been shaping all morning. The scent of sawdust, the warmth of sunlight on my face, it all felt like forgiveness had become part of the air. I leaned back in the chair, let my eyes wander through the window. Outside the yard looked alive again. The lilies Emma had planted last month had finally bloomed soft, white petals, catching the light. The repaired bench stood under the old oak tree, a patch of shadow, cradling it like a memory that had learned to rest. I watched Ethan for a while. He looked strong, not in the way of youth, but in the way of someone who'd carried weight and learned how to set it down. There was ease in his movements now, that kind of quiet confidence that comes when you stop running from your own story. And I realized something. This was what redemption actually looked like. Not applause, not miracles. Just a man and his son existing in the same silence without fear. I took a deep breath and let my mind drift. Time, I thought, as a craftsman, it gives us whether we agree to it or not. You fight it, it cuts deeper. You learn from it, it shapes something worth keeping. I'd spent most of my life trying to control it, trying to freeze. The good outwork, the bad rebuild what was already gone. But now I understood. Time doesn't ask for control. It asks for acceptance. Epictetus once said, "Don't demand that things happen as you wish, but wish that they happen as they do, and you will go on well." For years, I thought that was just philosophy, something you repeat when you're trying to sound wise. But sitting there in that chair by the window, watching the people I loved simply exist, I felt the truth of it, like sunlight through glass. I had demanded life to fit the picture I had in my head. A perfect family. A flawless son, a wife who never broke under my silence. And when life refused to obey, I punished. It punished them. Now I didn't want perfection. I wanted presence. The clock on the wall ticked softly. 11:54. Almost noon. The same clock that once haunted me at 12:17 every night. Now, I realized time didn't wound, it waited. Every second that passed wasn't a loss. It was an invitation to return. Emma came into the room, wiping her hands on a towel. "You've been sitting there a while," she said, smiling. "Yeah," I murmured. "Feels different now." She tilted her head. "How so?" "It used to feel like the house was watching me," I said. "Now it feels like it's listening." She smiled softly, walked over and sat beside me on the armrest, her shoulder against mine. "That's because you finally started talking." I laughed under my breath. Guess I did. We sat there in silence. Outside, Ethan called out something about lunch. Emma answered. I didn't move. I just kept watching the light. For a moment, the scene froze in my mind, the house breathing, the garden blooming. The sound of life threading through every corner of what once was hollow. I thought about how strange it was that peace never announces its arrival. It just slips in quietly once you stop looking for it in the noise. I picked up the old watch from the table, the same one Emma had placed on Ethan's nightstand months ago. It was still ticking, steady, defiant, patient. The tiny hand had moved through storms and silences and tears, and it was still moving. I smiled. Guess you were right, I whispered to no one in particular. Everything fixable just needs time and a reason to keep ticking. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill. It pecked once at the glass, curious, then flew away, leaving behind a faint trace of dust where its wings had touched. Emma stood and kissed the top of my head. Come eat philosopher, she teased. In a minute, I said. She lingered for a second, then nodded. Don't take too long. The world waits. For no one. When she left, I looked around the room. The walls, the floor, the window. Everything was ordinary again, but inside that ordinariness, there was something holy. I reached for my notebook and then wrote a single line. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It teaches the heart how to live there without dying. Then I set the pen down, leaned back in the chair, and let the sunlight reach me. The world outside was quiet, but inside, everything was finally alive. The bench creaked softly as Ethan sat down under the oak. Emma's laughter drifted through the open window. And somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed 12 times noon, not midnight. The same hour that used to mark endings now felt like a beginning. I closed my eyes. The warmth of light pressed gently against my eyelids, and I realized for the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of time anymore. Because time, like love, had stopped feeling. Like something I was losing. It felt like something I was part of. And from that chair by the window, the same place where I'd once watched everything fall apart, I whispered, not to anyone, but to life itself. Thank you for staying.